Hello and welcome to the Investigative Lens, where we examine real-life mysteries and conspiracies through a critical eye. I'm your host, Chloe, and today we're diving into a story that has haunted investigators and activists for decades. It's about a young woman named Karen Silkwood, a whistleblower who took on a powerful nuclear company and died under suspicious circumstances. Karen Silkwood's death in 1974 has all the elements of a thriller, including corporate secrets, radioactive materials, and a fatal car crash that may not have been an accident. Was she silenced for speaking out, or was it a tragic coincidence? We'll unravel this chilling tale, piece by piece, focusing on the dangers of whistleblower retaliation and the possible motives behind her mysterious death. Are you ready to look through the investigative lens at the case of Karen Silkwood? Let's get started. Karen Silkwood wasn't a lifelong activist or famous rabble-rouser. She was, in many ways, an ordinary person. Born in 1946 in Texas, Karen was a bright student with a knack for science. By 1972, at age 26, she found herself working as a laboratory technician at a Kerr-McGee nuclear fuel plant near Crescent, Oklahoma. This plant handled plutonium, a highly radioactive element used to make nuclear fuel rods and nuclear weapons material. Karen was also a mother of 3 children from a previous marriage, trying to rebuild her life after a divorce. She needed a good job to support her family, and Kerr-McGee provided that. But it also exposed her to an environment full of hidden hazards. Before long, Karen became involved with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union at the plant. In fact, she made history there by becoming the first woman elected to the union's local bargaining committee. Her role on the committee was to look into health and safety issues, and Karen took that job seriously. She began paying close attention to how the plant was run, and what she found was alarming. Karen discovered numerous safety violations and dangerous conditions at the facility. To give you an idea, here are some of the problems she noted. Workers exposed to radiation contamination far beyond safe limits. Faulty respiratory equipment that didn't properly protect people from inhaling radioactive dust. Improper storage of radioactive samples, creating contamination risks. Inadequate shower facilities for decontamination, which meant employees couldn't wash off radiation effectively. Even evidence of missing or misplaced plutonium, meaning some of this deadly material was unaccounted for. These issues weren't just minor oversights. They were serious threats to worker safety and public health. Karen was understandably alarmed. Imagine working with one of the most dangerous substances on Earth and realizing your company isn't following basic safety protocols. She felt a moral duty to act. As a union safety officer and a concerned worker, Karen decided to blow the whistle on Kerr-McGee's practices. By mid-1974, Karen Silkwood was gathering evidence and raising her concerns up the chain. In late September 1974, she and 2 fellow union committee members flew to Washington, D.C. for a secret meeting at the union's legislative office. There, they met with Tony Mazzocchi, a national union leader, and presented their findings to officials from the Atomic Energy Commission, the government body overseeing nuclear facilities. Karen and her colleagues laid out the numerous health and safety violations they had witnessed at Kerr-McGee. The regulators essentially responded, "If you're claiming this, show us proof." So Karen was tasked with collecting documentary evidence to back up all the allegations. Over the next several weeks, Karen diligently gathered documents, logs, and records from the plant. Anything that could prove what was going wrong. She was essentially building a case against her employer. The union hoped that these records would be an exclusive bombshell to drop on the company during upcoming contract negotiations. If they could expose Kerr-McGee's safety failures to the public and the press, it would not only protect workers, but also give the union leverage to demand changes. Karen knew this evidence was powerful, and she was determined to get it into the right hands. By November 1974, Karen had compiled a folder full of sensitive documents. She was in contact with a New York Times investigative reporter named David Burnham and had arranged to meet him, along with OCAW union official Steve Wadka, to hand over the information. This was a risky step, essentially blowing the whistle in a very public way. But Karen Silkwood was ready to do it. She understood the potential personal consequences, yet she pressed on. However, as it turns out, getting that truth out would cost her dearly. As Karen prepared to come forward, strange and frightening things began happening to her. It seemed that forces were aligning to intimidate or harm her in the days leading up to her big reveal. One incident in particular still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. On November 5th, 1974, Karen was doing routine work in one of the lab's glove boxes, sealed containers used to handle plutonium. Suddenly, an alarm sounded. Karen checked herself with a radiation detector and discovered that her body was covered in plutonium. In fact, she was contaminated with almost 400 times the legal limit of radiation. This was a shocking amount. She was immediately pulled out of work and given decontamination showers and medical tests. Everyone wondered, how could this happen? The more they investigated, the stranger it got. The plutonium was found on the inside of Karen's work gloves, even though the gloves had no punctures or leaks. In other words, the radioactive material hadn't seeped through a hole. It somehow got inside the gloves, directly onto her hands and arms. That's not something that happens by accident. It suggested that the contamination might have been deliberate. Plant doctors monitored Karen closely over the next few days. She was sent home with test kits to collect her urine and feces for analysis, to see if she had ingested any plutonium. The results were disturbing. Over the next week, Karen's samples showed extremely high levels of plutonium, and her apartment was found to be contaminated too. Yes, her home, away from the plant, somehow had plutonium in it. The highest concentrations were detected in her bathroom and even on a package of bologna and cheese in her refrigerator. Imagine checking your fridge and finding out your food is radioactive. This meant that plutonium had been introduced into her living space. Karen's roommate and boyfriend also worked at Kerr-McGee, but no one else in her household had anywhere near Karen's level of exposure. To this day, no one knows exactly how Karen Silkwood became so contaminated with plutonium. Kerr-McGee's management suggested that perhaps Karen herself secretly took plutonium out of the plant, essentially accusing her of poisoning herself to make the company look bad. Many of Karen's friends and fellow whistleblowers, however, believed the opposite, that someone from the company intentionally contaminated Karen on her person or in her home as a warning or to sabotage her credibility. After all, if Karen appeared to be careless enough to get contaminated, it might undermine any claims she made about the company's safety issues. Karen was frightened, and who wouldn't be? She had radioactive material in her body. A later examination showed she likely ingested some plutonium, which can cause cancer. She had to undergo medical treatments and extensive decontamination of her home. It's hard to imagine the stress she was under, knowing that her life might be in danger from the inside, radiation, and possibly from the outside, hostile forces trying to stop her. Still, despite these terrifying events, Karen did not back down from her plan. If anything, these incidents likely convinced her even more of how important it was to expose what was happening at Kerr-McGee. But time was running out. Now we come to the fateful night of November 13th, 1974, the night Karen Silkwood was supposed to go public with her evidence, and the night she met her end. That evening, Karen finished a union meeting and got into her small white Honda to drive to Oklahoma City, where she was set to meet reporter David Burnham from the New York Times and OCAW official Steve Wodka. She had with her a binder or folder stuffed with documents, the proof of the plant's negligence and cover-ups that she had collected. This was going to be the big handoff, the moment she would blow the whistle to the national press. One can only imagine how she felt as she drove off, likely nervous, but resolute, knowing she was doing the right thing. Karen never made it to that meeting. Sometime later that night, drivers on Oklahoma State Highway 74 came upon a horrific scene. Karen's Honda had veered off the road and smashed into a concrete culvert near Crescent, Oklahoma. The car was wrecked. When first responders arrived, Karen Silkwood was dead at the scene. She was just 28 years old. At first glance, the incident looked like a straightforward car accident. The road was dark and slightly curvy, the kind of place where a lone driver might lose control if they were tired or distracted. An autopsy would later reveal that Karen had a significant amount of a sedative called Quaalude in her system, a dose high enough that it could have made her drowsy while driving. The official story put forward was that Karen fell asleep at the wheel or otherwise lost control, leading to a one-car crash. In fact, this was the initial conclusion: a tragic accident. But very quickly, evidence emerged that cast doubt on the simple accident narrative. An accident investigator examining the crash scene noticed skid marks on the road, suggesting Karen had hit the brakes suddenly. If she had just fallen asleep peacefully, you wouldn't expect braking. Skid marks imply she was awake and trying to stop or avoid something. Even more telling, the investigator found a dented area on the rear bumper of Karen's car, as if the car had been hit from behind by another vehicle. This dent was suspicious because it didn't match the damage from the car hitting the culvert. It looked more like another car had collided with Karen's Honda. And then there was the matter of the missing folder. Remember those important documents Karen was carrying to give to the reporter? Well, they conveniently vanished from the wreckage. According to witness testimony and the investigating trooper, papers were scattered all over the scene of the accident. These papers were gathered, put in the wrecked car, and towed away. This is the last time anyone saw them. Karen's purse was there. Her personal items were there. But the papers that were potentially incriminating to Kerr-McGee had vanished. This fact alone raised huge suspicions. So what really happened on that highway? To sum up the mystery, Karen Silkwood died in a car crash that night, but the circumstances were highly suspicious. She had a sedative in her system, possibly making her vulnerable. There were signs her car was forced off the road, and the very evidence she was bringing to expose the truth was inexplicably missing. This convergence of factors suggests that her death might not have been an accident at all. Was Karen Silkwood run off the road and murdered to keep her quiet? Many people, then and now, believe that's exactly what happened. In the wake of Karen's death, there was an outcry from her union and many in the public. The story made national headlines. The idea that a whistleblower could have been killed for trying to expose a safety scandal at a nuclear plant was shocking, yet it felt plausible, given all the strange evidence. Investigations were launched, but the truth proved elusive. The local police and the FBI looked into the crash and Karen's allegations, but no definitive proof of foul play was produced. Officially, her death remains unexplained. Effectively, an unsolved case. No one was ever charged with harming Karen Silkwood. That said, a lot of people have never believed it was just an accident. For one, Karen's union colleagues were convinced she was silenced. Tony Mazzocchi, the OCAW legislative director who had been helping Karen, later said an expert had examined the crash and found clear signs of sabotage. An independent investigator provided convincing evidence that Silkwood's car was struck from the rear and driven off the road, causing her death, Mazzocchi revealed. In other words, a professional accident reconstruction supported the theory that another vehicle rammed Karen's car from behind, forcing her off the road. If that's true, it means someone intentionally caused her crash. Why would anyone do that? The motive seems straightforward: to prevent Karen from delivering that damning evidence against Kerr-McGee. Those documents reportedly proved that the company had falsified quality control reports and neglected critical safety measures. If Karen had handed them to the New York Times, it could have led to enormous legal and financial consequences for Kerr-McGee, not to mention public shame. Consider what was at stake. During the subsequent investigations, it came out that 20 to 30 kilograms of plutonium were missing from the plant's inventory. Yes, missing. That's enough plutonium to potentially build several nuclear bombs, and it was unaccounted for. This kind of revelation could have prompted the government to shut down the plant or charge executives with crimes. So, silencing Karen might have been seen by someone as a way to avoid all that fallout, quite literally, in terms of nuclear material. There's also the factor of intimidation. If Karen was indeed murdered, It served as a brutal message to any other workers who might think of blowing the whistle. It's like saying, "See what happened to her? Don't even think about doing the same." This is why Karen Silkwood's case is often cited in discussions of whistleblower retaliation. It's an extreme example of how far retaliation might go. Now, while some were pondering who could have run Karen off the road, Kerr-McGee and its supporters took a different approach. They went on the offensive to destroy Karen Silkwood's reputation. It's a sad and angering part of this story, but it's important to understand. With Karen gone and unable to defend herself, company officials and lawyers began to spread rumors and insinuations about her. They essentially tried to frame her as an unreliable, unstable person, hoping to discredit any claims she had made. The smear campaign was vicious. Kerr-McGee suggested that Karen had contaminated herself on purpose, or that her whole whistleblowing effort was a ploy because she was a troubled woman. In what's now a notorious example of character assassination, the company's representatives slung every bit of mud they could at her. They insinuated she was an emotionally unstable, abused drugs, that she was promiscuous, and had abandoned her children. Yes, they really said those things. By making her sound like a disturbed, immoral person, they hoped to make people doubt her allegations about the plant. It got so bad that during legal proceedings, Kerr-McGee's lawyer actually asked Karen's grieving family crude questions. In a deposition, the company attorney asked Karen's father, "Did she ever become hysterical?" and pressed her boyfriend with, "Do you think Karen may have been what medical science classifies as a nymphomaniac?" These outrageous questions show how far the company was willing to go to paint Karen as crazy or bad. It's a classic dirty tactic. In fact, whistleblower experts have a term for it, the nuts and sluts strategy. Basically, it means portraying a whistleblower as either mentally unhinged or of loose morals, especially if the whistleblower is a woman, to distract from the real issue. By attacking the messenger, they hope to deflect attention from the message, the very serious safety problems Karen was trying to reveal. Tragically, this smear campaign did succeed in some ways. It muddied the waters. Some people who didn't know Karen personally might have thought, "Oh, maybe she made it all up or was unstable." But those who did know her and those who looked at the evidence objectively saw through these attacks. The fact that Kerr-McGee went to such lengths to trash her character ironically made them look more guilty to many observers, as if they had something to hide. Meanwhile, Karen's family fought to get some justice. In 1976, Karen's father, Bill Silkwood, filed a lawsuit against Kerr-McGee on behalf of her estate. Not for murder. You can't sue a company for murder in civil court, and there wasn't enough proof of that anyway, but for the plutonium contamination Karen suffered and the company's negligence in allowing it. The trial that followed was dramatic and closely watched. In 1979, a jury agreed that Kerr-McGee had been grossly negligent. They awarded the Silkwood estate $505,000 in damages for personal injury to cover Karen's pain and suffering from radiation exposure and the destruction of her contaminated property, and $10 million in punitive damages to punish the company. This was a huge verdict, a clear message that the company was in the wrong. Kerr-McGee, of course, appealed and fought tooth and nail to avoid paying. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1984 upheld the idea that the company could indeed be held liable for punitive damages, even though nuclear safety is federally regulated. Facing the prospect of another trial and massive damages, Kerr-McGee eventually settled the case out of court in 1986. The company agreed to pay the Silkwood estate $1.38 million, a portion of the original verdict, without admitting liability. It wasn't the full amount the jury had awarded, but it was still seen as a victory for the family, an acknowledgement that Karen had been right to raise the alarm. Not long after Karen's death, the Kerr-McGee Cimarron plant shut down. It closed in 1979. Officially, the closure was due to business reasons, but there's no doubt that Karen Silkwood's case cast a long shadow over the facility. The company had lost public trust. In the years that followed, Kerr-McGee itself would exit the nuclear business entirely. It's hard not to see Karen's legacy in that. Karen Silkwood's story did not end with that settlement or the closing of the plant. In fact, over the past decades, her story has only grown in legend and significance. She has become, in many respects, a symbol of courageous whistleblowing and the potential perils that truth-tellers face. Former OCAW President Bob Wages perhaps said it best when he remarked, "Karen Silkwood risked her life because she cared about her fellow workers. Because of what she did, the companies were forced to make many changes that protect workers' lives and health to this day." Karen's actions did lead to improvements, increased scrutiny of safety in nuclear facilities, and greater awareness of workers' rights and protections. In fact, Karen Silkwood is often cited as one of the most famous workplace whistleblowers of all time, and her name has become synonymous with the fight for safety on the job. Her life has been the subject of books, articles, and that famous 1983 film, Silkwood, starring Meryl Streep as Karen, which brought her story to an even wider audience. Through these retellings, new generations have learned about Karen and been inspired by her bravery. Even today, nearly 50 years later, there are documentaries and podcasts, like this one, re-examining her case and its implications. There's something about Karen's story that resonates. Perhaps because we know that whistleblowers are still vitally important in our society and still at risk. From corporate whistleblowers to government leakers, those who speak out often face severe backlash. Karen's case is an extreme example, but it underscores the need for strong protections for anyone who dares to stand up and say, "This is wrong." It's worth noting that because of Karen Silkwood and others like her, there have been some improvements in whistleblower protections. Laws have been strengthened, albeit slowly, and there's greater public awareness that retaliation does happen and should not be tolerated. Yet, the battle is ongoing, and Karen's story remains a cautionary tale. It asks us to consider, what is the true cost of speaking truth to power? And are we, as a society, doing enough to safeguard those who do? In the end, whether Karen Silkwood was murdered or not, her courage changed things. She could have kept her head down and ignored the safety violations to protect herself, but she chose to protect others. She paid the ultimate price, but her impact is still felt. Karen's lens on the truth forced the world to take notice. And now, I want to turn the question to you, dear listeners. What do you think happened to Karen Silkwood? Do you believe her death was a tragic accident, or do you suspect, as many do, that she was silenced because of what she knew? There are compelling arguments on each side, and it's one of those mysteries that might never be conclusively solved. I encourage you to share your theories in the comments. Let's get a discussion going. This case still captivates and divides opinions, even after all these years. Perhaps you have some insight or have heard a theory that we didn't cover. I'd love to hear it. If you found this deep dive into the Karen Silkwood case engaging, please give this podcast a thumbs up and share it with others who might find it interesting. Your support really helps. And don't forget to subscribe to the Investigative Lens for more in-depth explorations of whistleblowers, mysteries, and conspiracies. We have many more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss them. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the Karen Silkwood mystery. Her story is a powerful reminder of the importance of truth and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the lens of investigation is the only thing that can bring dark truths to light. Take care, and see you in the next episode.